All right, today we're diving into a pretty provocative argument from a YouTube video by the channel Reflux. It's called What Destroyed the Brazilian Woman, and it lays out this very specific, very controversial historical thesis. Our job here is just to unpack it piece by piece so you can see exactly how the argument is built. Let's get into it. So, right out of the gate, the video lays its cards on the table with this quote. This is the core idea, the foundation for everything else that follows. The argument is that if you want to gauge the health of a nation, whether it's thriving or decaying, you have to look at its women. They're presented as the ultimate barometer. So, how exactly do they build this case? Well, here's the roadmap. We're going to follow their logic step by step. First, we'll look at this idea of women as a national symbol. Then, we'll dig into the very specific colonial history they present. From there, it's all about defining a traditional archetype, explaining what they call the modern downgrade, and finally landing on their final verdict. Okay, let's start with that foundational idea that women are symbolically fused with the very concept of a nation. The source makes an interesting point here, right? It asks us to think about how often great nations, from ancient Rome to the United States, are personified as female figures. Lady Liberty, Britannia, and so on. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the source makes a linguistic argument. It claims that the word nation, or nation, is rooted in the word nacer, which means to be born. Now, this isn't just a clever word game for the speaker. It's presented as proof that the idea of a nation is fundamentally tied to motherhood, and therefore, to women. All right, so how does this big idea connect specifically to Brazil? This next section is where the video zooms in on the country's colonial history, arguing that it created a totally unique kind of woman right from the very beginning. And wow, this slide really lays out the core of that argument in black and white. The video draws a sharp contrast. On one side, you have North America, which they say was settled by whole families, bringing their rigid, puritanical structure with them. And on the other, you have Brazil, settled almost exclusively by single men in what they describe as a lawless, high-testosterone environment, interacting with native tribes who were selling their women. So the takeaway here is crucial. According to the video, this completely different colonial setup created a certain mystique around the Brazilian woman from day one. For the Portuguese colonists, she became this coveted, valuable, and mysterious figure, and this, they argue, shaped the entire identity of the nation right from its birth. This brings us to the next piece of the puzzle, the source's description of the traditional society that grew out of that unique origin story. We're going to look at exactly how it defines patriarchy and the maybe surprising role it claims women played within it. Now, the video offers a very straightforward, almost business-like definition of a patriarchal society. In their telling, it's a clear division of labor. The man is the provider, the one who pays the bills and gives the orders. The woman, on the other hand, is the administrator, the powerful manager of the entire domestic world and the children. And then they take this family structure and they just scale it up to the entire nation. They call it a gigantic pyramid scheme. The idea is that the same model, a father figure at the top, repeats at every level of society, from the family to the plantation owners up to the nobility, and right to the top with the king, who's seen as the ultimate father of the nation. So, what was the actual result of this system according to the video? Well, this is where it gets a little counterintuitive. They argue that because men were busy with physical work, the traditional woman had a lot of free time at home, time she used to read, to cultivate her mind. And this, they claim, led to a country of soft men and strong women, even pointing to major historical figures like Empress Leopoldina and Princess Isabel as the prime examples of this powerful female archetype. Okay, so we've got this picture of the traditional archetype, right? Well, this is where the narrative takes a really sharp turn. This next section is all about what the source calls the modern downgrade and the key events that supposedly caused it. The video argues this whole decline really boils down to two huge societal shifts, two major game changers. Let's break them down. First up, it's all about economics. The video claims that when women entered the workforce en masse, it was a massive win for corporations. Why? Because it instantly doubled the labor pool. And with twice as many workers competing for jobs, companies could essentially cut wages in half, getting way more production without spending any more money. And that first cause leads directly into the second. If mothers are now out of the home and at work, what happens to the kids? Well, they were moved into state-run schools. The source presents this as a massive turning point, where the power to educate and shape children was taken away from the family and the church and handed over to the state. This slide is basically the entire argument in a nutshell. It's the before and after.
On one side, you have the traditional woman, who's portrayed as having free time, a big family, and an education centered at home. On the other, the modern woman, who is described as being trapped by labor laws, educated by the state, and living in a culture that has normalized vices.
And all of this brings us to the final act, the big conclusion. What, according to the source, is the modern consequence of this supposed downgrade for women and for Brazil as a whole? Now, the speaker makes a really important distinction here. The argument isn't as simple as, say, a woman watches a certain movie and her behavior changes. No, it's much broader. It's about the entire culture shifting to normalize behaviors that used to have a social stigma attached, effectively removing what they see as traditional guardrails. And this is where the argument really comes full circle. The source poses this question to hammer its point home. If mothers are trapped at work and their kids are in state schools, the video's conclusion is that control over the values and minds of the next generation has been completely transferred from the family to the state. And then comes the final verdict. I mean, there's no pulling punches here. This is a direct quote that acts as the speaker's ultimate judgment on where the modern woman is headed, and it's a pretty bleak picture of unhappiness and personal failure. So there you have it. From being a symbol of national strength and intelligence to this really harsh final judgment. That's the trajectory that the source material calls the great downgrade of the Brazilian woman. It's a complex and controversial argument, for sure, weaving together history, economics, and culture to paint its picture of a civilization in decline.